I'm Mia. I'm a 35-year-old office worker. Recently, my boyfriend Tom, who had been on an overseas assignment for a long time, returned to the United States. During our nearly 10 years of long-distance relationship, we faced several crises of breaking up, but each time we talked it out and overcame them. Although my dream of getting married in my 20s didn't come true, I realized that age doesn't matter as long as I have him. I was content. We should soon pay a visit to both of our parents. Whose house shall we visit first, Mia or mine? Tom asked me this during our date, and I found myself at a loss for words. Well, as I hesitated, he looked puzzled. Hey, you're not going to say you don't want to marry now, are you? I've finally managed to return to the United States. No, it's not that. It's just, I'm happy that Tom has come back. But the reason I added but was because the image of Tom's mother popped into my mind. The thought of marrying Tom and having his mother come with the package cast a dark shadow over the idea of our marriage. I first met Tom's mother, Mrs. Jane, 10 years ago. I was 25 at the time. I unexpectedly bumped into Mrs. Jane during a date with Tom, my colleague at the time. Tom, what are you doing here? Oh, are you on a date? Nice to meet you, I'm Jane, Tom's mother. Mrs. Jane was 47 at the time. I was surprised when I first saw her because she looked incredibly youthful and beautiful for someone in her mid-40s. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Mia, dating Tom. Mrs. Jane looked me up and down thoroughly. It was clearly a judgmental gaze, assessing another woman's level. My feeling wasn't just paranoia because as soon as Tom stepped away to the restroom, Mrs. Jane said, I knew Tom had a girlfriend, but I thought she would be cuter. I didn't know Tom wasn't picky about looks. Mrs. Jane smirked maliciously as she said it. Not just the face, but the body type too, right? Let's say curvy, or in worse terms, fat. Oh dear, I shouldn't say such things, should I? She clearly didn't feel sorry at all. Sure, I'm on the curvy side, but what a thing to say to someone you've just met. Just as I was about to retort, Tom came back from the restroom. Oh, welcome back. I was just having a nice chat with Mia. We've become so close, right, Maya? The moment Tom returned, Mrs. Jane swiftly switched back to the mask of a good mother, smiling sweetly at me. Wow, what a drastic change. I was astounded. After leaving the cafe, I asked Tom, So, what's your mother like? She's quite beautiful, isn't she? Oh yes, she was quite the beauty in her hometown, even crowned as Miss Something or Other in her younger days. That's why she still takes great care of her beauty. I suppose she doesn't look too bad for her age, does she? Indeed, she might not look bad. She appeared about 15 years younger than her actual age, but her heart was the worst. However, I couldn't bring myself to say such things to Tom, who seemed a bit proud of his beautiful mother. But then I thought, if I marry Tom, she'll become my mother-in-law. Honestly, that thought filled me with apprehension at the time. Then came the 10 years. Soon after Tom was assigned to work in New York, he left for New York, and naturally, our wedding plans were put on hold. I hadn't seen Mrs. Jane for all that time. Yet, hey, are you still feeling unsure about marrying me? Lost in my thoughts, Tom's voice brought me back to reality. I guess yes, so your father might be worried about you marrying someone like me. Oops, I need to be careful. I got caught up in unpleasant memories from the past. It seems I've unintentionally given Tom the wrong impression. It's nothing like that. I'm just experiencing a bit of pre-wedding jitters. Don't worry, I'm definitely up for getting married, I said to Tom, trying to sound cheerful. No matter what kind of person the future mother-in-law is, I'm not marrying her after all. And it's been 10 years, surely she must have mellowed a bit by now. I tried to reassure myself. But that was nothing more than a fleeting hope. The following month on the weekend, I was heading to Tom's house, not for a marriage proposal visit, but just to pick up something he forgot. Tom, of all things, forgot the movie tickets for our cinema date at home. We lost the chance for a leisurely lunch, but it was fine. We'll just enjoy hot dogs and popcorn while watching the movie. We should just make it in time. Wait here for a sec. I'll be right back with them as soon as we arrived at his house. Tom said this and hurriedly went upstairs. So noisy, Tom. Are you back? Ah, you are. Hearing Tom's voice, Mrs. Jane appeared at the entrance. Hi, hello, I greeted her, and Mrs. Jane suddenly burst into laughter. Oh my, it's that girl from 10 years ago, the chubby piggy. Chubby pig, she must be referring to me. Oh my, am I still together? Tom really has unique tastes, doesn't he? I never thought he'd still be with the same girl after all this time. Why doesn't he switch to a younger woman? She said with a faint smirk on her face. I couldn't believe my ears at Mrs. Jane's words. Huh. Of course, right? Tom's an elite who returned from New York. There must be plenty of women aiming for him. You might have slimmed down a bit in the last 10 years, but on the flip side, there's been some decline, hasn't there? If you were in your 20s a decade ago, that makes you in your 30s now, right? Oh my, you're practically an old lady now. If I've aged over the last 10 years, then Mrs. Jane must have aged too, right? But when I thought about it, Mrs. Jane looked exactly the same as she did 10 years ago, so much so I wondered if she was not just a beautiful witch, but a real witch. Hey, Mia, right? If you had any common sense, you'd step back yourself, don't you think? Ask yourself if you're truly worthy of Tom deep in your heart. Just then, Tom came bounding down the stairs again. Sorry for the wait. Took me a while to find the tickets. Let's go. Oh, Mom, what's up? Miss Jane answered with a nonchalant face. It's nothing, dear. Come on, you don't want to miss the movie, don't you? Right? Let's go, Mia. Tom grabbed my arm and led me out of the house. I couldn't say anything to Mrs. Jane, and I also couldn't say anything to Tom. What would Tom think if he knew what his mother said? I didn't want to upset him, but I knew I couldn't let things continue this way. With that mother-in-law in the picture, there's no way I could be happy in marriage. But what should I do? I didn't know. Sometime later, Tom came to my house to get approval for our marriage. Of course, my parents said okay. It seemed my father had always hoped I would marry a man of his choosing, but he respected my decision as it was the man I chose. My father made a request, but it was up to us whether to fulfill it or not. Well, I guess we've cleared Mia's house. Next is my house next weekend, Tom said, stretching out as we left my house. Yes, at Tom's house, Mrs. Jane would be there. I would need to get her approval for our marriage. Will it be okay? As I felt anxious, Tom reassured me, it'll be fine. I'm with you, which eased my worries a bit. And then, finally, the next weekend arrived. My heart was pounding. What's up, Mia? Are you nervous? Seeing me taking deep breaths, Tom laughed. I understand. I was super nervous when I went to greet Mia's parents, too, especially since your dad is my boss, but it's okay. Both my parents are easygoing. You've met my mom before, right? It's precisely because I've met Mrs. Jane before and because it's her that I'm so nervous. In my mind, I screamed silently, Hello, welcome, you must be Mia. Nice to meet you, as Tom's father greeted me warmly when I opened the door. Welcome, then Mrs. Jane appeared from behind. Seeing her, I shuddered. Her makeup was too much. It was like she was ready for a party. With such intense makeup, her eyes were shimmering with glittery eyeshadow. Her outfit wasn't a party dress, but it was something one might wear to the theater. It seemed like her preparation was more about establishing dominance than welcoming me. I discreetly checked my own outfit. My clothes were fine, my stockings had no runs, and my accessories weren't too flashy. My blouse was freshly laundered without a single wrinkle, my hair was neatly styled, and I had just touched up my lipstick in the restroom at the station. Then, as Mrs. Jane passed by me, she said, "You've got lipstick on your teeth." I quickly covered my mouth in panic, but when I checked in the mirror when no one was looking, there was no lipstick on my teeth. Mrs. Jane had lied just to see me flustered. I put my compact back into my bag and stared at my phone inside for a while. I couldn't help but think that today's greeting might just determine my fate. Mrs. Jane, carrying tea on a tray, entered the living room with Tom's father. "Mom, Dad, I'd like to introduce Mia, the person I want to marry, though, Mom, you've met her already." Tom broke the ice, and I greeted them. "My name is Mia. I am happy to see you." Tom's father laughed and said, "Don't be so formal. If Tom chose you, we as parents don't have much to say about it. Our son isn't perfect either and might cause you some trouble, but we're counting on you, right, Jane?" When Tom's father turned to her, Mrs. Jane smiled in a fluster. Yes, nice to meet you, Mia." Afterward, we had tea and chatted pleasantly. I was relieved. I had been worried Mrs. Jane would oppose the marriage, but it seemed like the greetings went smoothly. Oh my, look at the time. After some friendly conversation, Mrs. Jane looked at the clock on the wall and said, "Sorry about this, but I've been so busy today, I haven't had a chance to prepare dinner. I'll order some pizza." "Just wait a moment, Tom. Go to the pizza place with your father and order some takeout." "Really? Why go there in person? Can't we just order it over the phone?" "Normally, it's standard to order takeout over the phone, but you know our usual pizza place hardly ever answers their phone. It's quicker to go there directly and also grab some beer and wine and pick up some snacks from the supermarket." Mrs. Jane urged Tom and her husband, almost forcing them off the sofa. "Come on, hurry up, or it'll get late. Enjoy your shopping trip together, just the two of you." With Mrs. Jane's insistence, Tom and his father left the house. The reason for sending them away together became clear soon enough. As soon as they were gone, Mrs. Jane dropped her kind mother facade. "Ah, so it's come to this, has it? Really? Such a cheeky woman. What do you mean?" Mrs. Jane, lounging on the sofa with her legs crossed, said, "I've always told Tom that a woman like you isn't suitable for him. You lack the decency to step back on your own. Really, with Tom's looks, he could get a much more beautiful younger woman. Here you are, an older woman, clinging on to him before he even knows what to do, acting like once you've set your sights on your prey, you'll never let go, showing up brazenly for a marriage introduction. I had to ask, what exactly about me do you find so displeasing?" Everything about you trying to take Tom from me. Just the thought of it irks me." I defended myself, but Tom likes how I look. I know I'm not a world-class beauty, but Mrs. Jane laughed mockingly. "Think about it. If Tom has children, they'll be my grandchildren. If they're not cute, I couldn't bear to call them my grandchildren. Imagine inheriting handsome genes and then marrying someone with a plain face, diluting the DNA." Mrs. Jane then leaned in so close, like I could feel her breath. "Listen here, even if you marry Tom, I'll never accept you as my daughter-in-law. I'll find a way to break you up even after the wedding. Then I'll find him a younger woman as beautiful as me, though finding someone as beautiful as me is hard." Of course, I gripped my bag tightly that was lying beside me. "So if I leave now, would that satisfy you, Mrs. Jane?" "Well, yes. If you could just disappear forever, that would be wonderful." "I understand," I replied. "I'll do as you say." "That's right, that's what you should do. And don't bother telling Tom or my husband. It's useless. I'm always the beautiful wife and kind mother. No one would believe you." Then Mrs. Jane stood up from the sofa, looking down at me, and said, "Don't ever show your dirty face here again." Just then, the sound of the front door opening could be heard. We're back. Suddenly, Mrs. Jane burst into tears. "What's wrong?" In my confusion, Mrs. Jane turned to the two men who had just entered the living room and accused, "It's awful. Mia verbally attacked me while you were gone. I don't think I can ever get along with her." Huh. I was astonished. When did I ever verbally assault Mrs. Jane? Mia said she'd rather not care for us when we get old, even saying it would be better if we went to heaven sooner rather than later, and that she'd treat us horribly if we became senile. Oh, I can't even say it. She's scary. Mrs. Jane clung to Tom's father, playing the victim. "How could you, Maya? Tom's father frowned at me. You seemed like a good person, but I can't believe you'd say such harsh things. No, that's not true. I didn't say anything like that. In fact, I was the one who was verbally abused as I tried to defend myself. Mrs. Jane cried out in tears, "Liar! Do you think I'm such a rude person? Then show some proof." That's right. I can't believe my wife would lie. Tom's father seemed completely on Mrs. Jane's side. Tom started to say something, but I stopped him. If you're talking about proof, there's no evidence that I insulted Mrs. Jane either, is there? Well, that's true. My calm rebuttal seemed to overwhelm Tom's father. If there's no evidence for either side, it just becomes a pointless argument. Unfortunately, I do have evidence on my side. What? Mrs. Jane, in utter shock, stopped her fake crying and exclaimed. It seems she never dreamed I would have evidence. I've been recording on my phone since I arrived. Considering Mrs. Jane's previous remarks, I thought something like this might happen. I'm glad I was cautious. What do you mean by your previous remarks? Tom looked surprised at my words. Proof is stronger than arguments. I took out my phone from my bag and pressed the playback button on the voice recorder. Really? Such a cheeky woman. Old woman, I'll never accept you as my daughter-in-law. Disappear forever. Don't ever show your ugly face again, Mrs. Jane's ugly epithet echoed in the living room. Stop it. Mrs. Jane lunged at me, but Tom restrained her. Mom, stop it. But Tom, this is a mistake. Mia is trying to frame me. Mom, just stop, please. Tears welled up in Tom's eyes. Realizing the true nature of his mother must have been devastating. I sympathized with Tom, but there was no turning back now. I've been verbally abused by Mrs. Jane since I first met her 10 years ago. It's because she's beautiful and I'm just average. But no matter how beautiful someone is on the outside, I can't accept someone so ugly at heart as my mother-in-law. So I won't marry Tom, and as you wish, I'll never come back here again. Wait, Mia, my wife was out of line. Let's talk this over again. Tom's father flustered, apologized, but Tom had something to say. It's impossible now, Dad. It's not just about Mia. I can't accept such a woman as my mother anymore. You probably don't want to be a family with Mom or Dad anymore either, so I've decided to follow Mia's father's request and become an adopted son-in-law in Mia's family. What? Mrs. Jane exclaimed in shock. Mia's dad is the president of the company. I'm working for Tom, explained so MIA is not only my colleague, but also the president's daughter. When I visited Mia's house to greet them, her father pleaded for me to become an adopted son-in-law. I was undecided about taking over the company, but I've just made up my mind. I will take Mia's last name and live as a member of her family. But Tom, what about this house, Mom? Do you really think I would take over this house? Do you seriously believe that? Tom was in tears. Standing beside him, Tom's father patted Tom's shoulder, saying, If it's Tom's decision, I won't say anything. I'm sorry for making you make such a sad decision. I'll make sure Mrs. Jane doesn't complain. I interjected, Yes, I would like to thank you for that, but Tom's father looked puzzled. It seemed he had only heard a part of the recording earlier. Tom had listened carefully and was deeply shocked. As much as it pains me to make him listen again, the truth must be revealed. With a heavy heart, I said, Dad, you might get busier in the future. There will probably be a need for things like DNA testing. I pressed the play button on my phone again. Stop it. Stop. Don't listen to it. Mrs. Jane panicked, realizing what was about to be played, but it was too late. As Mrs. Jane's voice from the phone said, I received handsome genes and bore a good-looking child, and my child's spouse had a poor face. Wouldn't it dilute the DNA? Tom's father's face turned furious. What? The ensuing chaos was something I'd rather not remember. Tom's father lunged at Mrs. Jane, and Tom and I desperately tried to stop him while Mrs. Jane screamed and cried. The commotion was so intense that the neighbors called the police. Months later, Tom and I married. As he declared, Tom became an adopted son-in-law and estranged himself from his mother. However, he didn't sever ties with his father. The real parent-child relationship was denied through DNA testing, but they had lived as father and son for over 30 years. If Tom and I have children in the future, we plan to show their faces to their grandfather, Tom's father. And Mrs. Jane are getting divorced. Mrs. Jane was sent back to her parents' home where she was unwelcome and eventually cast out, and now her whereabouts are unknown. Well, knowing her, she's probably being disliked wherever she goes for constantly speaking ill of others. Mrs. Jane, who once effortlessly maintained her witchy charm in a life of luxury, might now deteriorate into a mere witch struggling with her new hardships. That's what I think.